In the forgotten villages of Romania, where ancient forests whisper secrets older than memory, there exists a terror so profound that entire communities will violate the most sacred of grounds to confront it. This is not the polished vampire of Hollywood films or the romantic bloodsucker of modern fiction. This is something far more intimate, far more horrifying. This is the world of the Strigoi, where death is not an ending, but a twisted beginning. Welcome to Vanishing Legends, where we dive deep into the forgotten horrors and mysteries that once haunted our ancestors. If you're fascinated by the dark folklore that shaped entire cultures, hit that subscribe button now, because we're about to uncover stories that will change how you think about the legends you thought you knew. What could drive a peaceful farming community to dig up their own father's grave in the dead of night? What terror could be so overwhelming that loving family members would take an axe to the corpse of their beloved grandmother? To understand this unthinkable desperation, we must journey back to a time when the boundary between life and death was not a wall, but a door that could swing both ways. Long before the crosses dotted the Carpathian landscape, before the Roman legions ever set foot on this ancient soil, the people of this land lived in a world where spirits walked among the living as naturally as the morning mist rolled through the valleys. The Dacians and their ancestors understood something that our modern world has forgotten. The soul, they believed, was not a passenger waiting for departure. It was a resident, bound to the earth by invisible threads of memory, love, and sometimes rage. In their animistic worldview, every tree possessed consciousness, every stream held wisdom, and every mountain peak served as a gateway between realms. Death was not the final chapter of existence, but merely a transformation, a shifting from one state of being to another. The dead remained part of the community, watching from the shadows, influencing the harvest, protecting their descendants, or in some cases, seeking revenge upon those who had wronged them. When Christianity arrived in these mountains, it did not erase these ancient beliefs. Instead, like water finding cracks in stone, the old ways seeped into the new faith, creating something unique and terrifying. The spirits of the forest became demons. The wandering souls became something far more sinister, and the fear of the restless dead transformed into one of Europe's most enduring nightmares. But this transformation did not happen overnight. For centuries, these beliefs festered in the collective unconscious of the Romanian people, growing stronger with each generation, fed by genuine terror and desperate need for explanation. Because in a world without modern medicine, without scientific understanding of disease and decay, the Strigoi provided answers to questions that had no other solution. The curse of the Strigoi was not something that struck randomly. In the intricate web of Romanian folklore, certain souls were marked from the moment of their first breath. The circumstances of birth could seal a person's dark destiny before they had even opened their eyes to see the world that would one day fear them. The most dreaded of these omens was to be born with the caul, a thin membrane that sometimes covers a newborn's head like a gossamer veil. To modern medicine, this is merely a harmless quirk of biology, occurring in perhaps 1 in every 80,000 births. But to the midwives and village elders of old Romania, it was a fragment of the shroud from the other world, a sign that this child had been touched by death before they had truly begun to live. The moments following such a birth were fraught with ritual and terror. The midwife, her hands trembling with the weight of ancient responsibility, would have to carefully remove this membrane without allowing the infant to swallow even the smallest piece. For if the child consumed any portion of their birth caul, their fate was sealed beyond any hope of redemption. They would become Strigoi, as surely as the sun rises in the east. Some midwives would burn the caul immediately, sending its otherworldly essence back to whatever realm it came from. Others would preserve it, believing it could serve as a protective talisman for the child throughout their life. But regardless of the precautions taken, that child would forever live under a shadow of suspicion, watched by neighbors who wondered not if, but when, the darkness within them would finally emerge. The number 7 held particular power in this supernatural arithmetic of doom. A 7th son, born in an unbroken line of male children, carried within himself a terrible gift. Such a child was believed to possess a second soul, often manifesting as an animal spirit that granted him extraordinary abilities during life. He might see ghosts, predict the weather, or heal certain ailments with a touch. But this gift came at a price that would be paid not in life, but in death. Upon his passing, it was this restless second soul that would refuse to find peace. While his human spirit might seek the light of heaven, his animal spirit would remain bound to earth, animating his corpse with unnatural hunger and malevolent purpose. The 7th son was thus blessed and cursed in equal measure, living his entire existence as a bridge between two worlds, never fully belonging to either. Even the circumstances of conception could doom a soul to this terrible fate. Children born out of wedlock carried not just the social stigma of their parents' sin, but a spiritual vulnerability that made them prime candidates for the curse. In a deeply religious society, where baptism was seen as the only protection against evil, an unbaptized child who died remained in spiritual limbo, their soul unable to find rest and dangerously susceptible to dark influences. These marked children would grow up knowing they were different, feeling the weight of suspicious glances and whispered conversations. Every childhood illness, every moment of unusual behavior, every display of what might be considered supernatural insight would be scrutinized by the community as potential evidence of their dark nature beginning to manifest. But the curse of the Strigoi was not limited to those marked from birth. A person could live an entirely ordinary life, beloved by family and respected by neighbors, only to be doomed by the manner of their death or the state of their soul when they departed this world. The ancient Romanians understood that there was a profound difference between a good death and a bad death. A good death meant dying peacefully in one's bed, surrounded by loved ones, having received the last rites of the church and made peace with both God and man. Such a soul would depart cleanly, ready for whatever judgment awaited in the next world. But a bad death was a violation of the natural order, a tearing of the fabric between worlds that left jagged edges through which evil could seep. The most feared of these was death by suicide, seen as the ultimate rejection of God's gift of life. Such a person was denied burial in consecrated ground, often interred at lonely crossroads outside the village limits where their tortured spirit could find no peace. Those who died with bitter grudges in their hearts, who felt they had been cheated or betrayed by those they trusted, carried their malevolence beyond the grave. Their powerful emotions, fueled by a sense of injustice, would not allow their spirits to rest. Instead, these feelings would reanimate their corpses, driving them to crawl from their graves, seeking a terrible and final revenge upon those who had wronged them. Murder victims too were at risk, their lives cut short before their appointed time, leaving them with unfinished business in the world of the living. Travelers who died far from home, without proper burial rites or the comfort of familiar ground, might become wandering spirits, forever seeking the rest that had been denied them. But perhaps most insidious of all was the curse that could be passed like a disease from one person to another. If someone died while under the malevolent influence of a living Strigoi, a witch or warlock who had used their dark powers to drain the victim's life force, that person was believed to be spiritually infected. They would rise from their grave not as themselves, but as a vessel for the same evil that had claimed them, perpetuating an endless cycle of supernatural predation. This is how the terror spread through Romanian villages like a plague of the soul, jumping from family to family, generation to generation, creating an atmosphere of constant vigilance and barely contained hysteria. Because the people understood that anyone could become a Strigoi, and once transformed, they would return not as the person they once were, but as something wearing their face while harboring only hunger and malice. The living Strigoi walked among the community undetected, appearing as ordinary neighbors while possessing abilities that defied natural law. They were the perfect hidden enemy, familiar faces concealing predatory spirits that could drain life itself from their victims without ever laying a hand upon them. These individuals, marked by fate or circumstance, were believed to possess a form of psychic vampirism that made them far more dangerous than any physical monster. They could steal the milk from a cow simply by looking at it with envious eyes, leaving the animal dry and useless to its owner. They could blight entire fields of crops with their malevolent will, turning green shoots into withered stalks overnight. Most terrifying of all was their ability to steal the very essence of human vitality. A healthy person could find themselves growing weak and listless after crossing paths with a living Strigoi, their strength mysteriously sapped, as if an invisible hand had reached into their chest and squeezed the life from their heart. Children would waste away despite eating well, their rosy cheeks turning pale as their energy was gradually drained by a neighbor whose envy had curdled into something far more sinister. The victims of this psychic predation rarely understood what was happening to them. They would visit doctors, seek the counsel of priests, try every folk remedy known to their grandmothers. But no medicine could cure what ailed them, because the source of their suffering was not physical disease, but spiritual theft. Their life force being consumed by a creature that appeared as human as themselves. And if you think this sounds like something from a nightmare, remember that for countless generations, this was reality for entire villages. Before we continue deeper into this world of living vampires and midnight terrors, make sure you're subscribed to Vanishing Legends, because we're just getting started with the horrors that await us. The true supernatural power of the living Strigoi was revealed not during their waking hours, but when they surrendered to sleep. On certain nights of the year, when the veil between worlds grew thin as morning frost, their spirits could detach from their physical bodies entirely. These dates were marked in red on the calendar of fear, nights like the Eve of St. Andrew and the Feast of St. George, when even the bravest villagers would barricade themselves behind doors blessed with garlic and holy water. While their bodies lay motionless in their beds, the disembodied souls of the living Strigoi would take flight, often assuming the forms of animals. Some became great black wolves, with eyes like burning coals. Others transformed into enormous ravens whose wings blotted out the stars. Still others took the shape of serpents that could slither through the smallest cracks in walls and windows. These spirit forms would gather at the edges of the village, at crossroads where three paths met, or in ancient clearings deep within the forest where no church bell had ever rung. There, in these liminal spaces between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, they would engage in terrible spectral battles that determined the fate of entire communities. Armed with weapons crafted from the tools of daily life, spindles from weaving looms, the curved blades of scythes, wooden clubs hewn from trees struck by lightning, they would fight with a fury that shook the very foundations of reality. The clash of these spirit armies could sometimes be heard as distant thunder on otherwise clear nights, or seen as strange lights dancing on the horizon like a deadly aurora. The outcome of these ghostly wars would decide whether the coming year would bring prosperity or disaster to the village. A victory by the benevolent spirits meant good harvests, healthy livestock, and marriages blessed with many children. But if the malevolent Strigoi triumphed in their midnight battles, the village would face drought, disease, failed crops, and death stalking through their streets like an uninvited guest. The villagers would wake on these morning afters with no knowledge of the supernatural conflict that had raged while they slept, but they would sense something in the air, a heaviness or lightness that spoke of their fate having been decided by forces beyond their control. They would watch the sky for omens, observe the behavior of their animals, and wait to discover which side had claimed victory in the war for their souls. But the community was not defenseless against these invisible predators. Generations of experience had taught them to recognize the signs of supernatural interference and to deploy an arsenal of protective measures that blended Christian faith with practices far older than any church. Garlic became their first line of defense, its pungent aroma and powerful essence believed to be anathema to all forms of evil spirits. Braids of the white bulbs would hang from every doorway and window, their scent permeating the air with a barrier that no strigoi could cross. Farmers would rub cloves of garlic on the horns of their cattle, ensuring that their livestock could not be drained of their milk or life force by envious neighbors. The thorny branches of wild roses were scattered on windowsills and doorsteps, their sharp points designed to snag and trap any wandering spirit that attempted to enter uninvited. These natural barriers served as a kind of supernatural barbed wire, creating painful obstacles for entities that existed more as energy than flesh. Perhaps most ingenious was the practice of scattering millet seeds around the perimeter of one's property. The ancient belief held that vampires and evil spirits were compelled by an irresistible urge to count, and would become trapped in the tedious task of numbering every single grain until the safety of sunrise drove them back to their lairs. Thousands of tiny seeds would carpet the ground like a mathematical maze, turning the creature's own obsessive nature against them. The sign of the cross was paramount in this spiritual warfare, carved into doorframes, painted on walls, and traced in the air whenever danger threatened. Holy water would be sprinkled in corners where shadows gathered too deeply, and incense would be burned to purify the very air of malevolent influences. But it was on the night of St. Andrew that these protective measures reached their peak of desperate intensity. This was considered the night of the wolves, when the barriers between worlds became as thin as tissue paper and the powers of darkness reached their terrible zenith. On this night, entire villages would effectively declare martial law against the supernatural. Every pot and pan in every household would be turned upside down, denying wandering spirits any vessel in which they might hide or from which they might work their mischief. Children would be kept awake through the long dark hours, for it was believed that sleeping souls were more vulnerable to spiritual attack. Families would huddle together around fires that burned throughout the night, their flames serving as both light and protection against the creatures that shunned illumination. The bravest souls would venture out only when absolutely necessary and never alone. They would move in groups, clutching crosses and muttering prayers, their eyes constantly scanning the shadows for movement that should not be there. Dogs would be brought indoors, for their keen senses could detect the presence of evil long before human perception would notice anything amiss, and their howling would alert the entire village to supernatural danger. These were the lengths to which entire communities would go to protect themselves from neighbors they had known their whole lives, people who had shared their bread and celebrated their children's births, but who might now harbor within themselves something hungry and inhuman. Trust became a luxury they could not afford, and vigilance became a burden they could not set down. Yet despite all these precautions, despite the garlic and the roses and the endless counting of seeds, the most profound terror still lay ahead. For all of these measures were designed to ward off the living strigoi and their wandering souls, temporary protections against threats that were still bound, however loosely, to mortal flesh. The true nightmare would begin when that flesh finally failed, when death released the spirit from its earthly prison and transformed suspicion into certainty, fear into absolute horror. Because when a suspected strigoi died, their transformation from hidden threat to undead monster would be complete, and no amount of garlic or holy water would be enough to protect the community from what they had become. The transformation from living strigoi to undead monster was not instantaneous. Romanian folklore understood that death was not a moment but a process, a gradual loosening of the bonds that held soul to flesh. For 40 days after burial, the spirit was believed to linger in a state of transition, journeying through familiar places, revisiting scenes of joy and sorrow, slowly preparing for whatever judgment awaited in the world beyond. For a peaceful soul, this was a sacred pilgrimage, a final farewell to earthly existence guided by angels and blessed spirits. But for a troubled or cursed soul, these 40 days became a period of immense spiritual danger, a window of time when the departed could lose their way entirely and become trapped between worlds like a fly caught in amber. The living kept constant vigil during this precarious period, understanding that their beloved dead were navigating treacherous waters that could either deliver them to eternal rest or condemn them to an existence worse than any hell imagined by theologians. Mirrors throughout the house would be covered with black cloth, for it was believed that a wandering soul might glimpse its own reflection and become so transfixed by the sight that it would forget its heavenly destination entirely. Clocks would be stopped at the moment of death, symbolically halting time for the deceased and creating a pocket of stillness in which their spirit could gather strength for the long journey ahead. Windows might be opened to allow the soul easy passage, while doors would be blessed and guarded to ensure that only benevolent spirits could enter to guide the departed on their way. Every ritual, every prayer, every protective charm was designed with dual purpose to help the peaceful soul find its path to paradise and to prevent the troubled soul from finding its way back to the world it should have left behind. Because the people understood with bone-deep certainty that some spirits would not go gentle into that good night, and their resistance to death's natural order would transform them into something monstrous. The burial rites themselves became exercises in sacred paranoia, elaborate ceremonies designed to ensure that the dead remained exactly where they belonged. If there was even the slightest suspicion that the deceased might harbor the potential for supernatural return, specific and powerful precautions would be woven into the funeral proceedings, like protective spells hidden within prayers. A stone or silver coin might be placed in the corpse's mouth, serving multiple protective functions according to ancient belief. The weight would prevent the dead from speaking curses or calling out to the living in voices that might lure them to destruction. The metal would create a barrier that evil spirits could not cross, sealing the portal of the mouth against supernatural intrusion. Sometimes the body would be positioned face down in its coffin, a practice that horrified Christian sensibilities, but served a grimly practical purpose in the minds of those who understood the Strigoi threat. If the creature somehow managed to animate and attempt to claw its way back to the surface, it would only succeed in digging itself deeper into the earth, farther from the world of the living it sought to terrorize. For the most feared cases, those individuals whose lives and deaths had marked them as almost certain candidates for undead resurrection, more extreme measures would be employed. A long iron nail might be driven through the skull, pinning the spirit to the body and preventing its escape. Or a sickle, that curved blade used to harvest grain from the fields, would be placed around the neck like a deadly necklace, positioned so that any attempt to rise would result in immediate decapitation. These were not acts of cruelty, but desperate attempts at prevention. Final insurance policies, written in iron and fear against a threat that could destroy not just individual families, but entire communities. The people who performed these grim rituals did so with heavy hearts, understanding that they were mutilating the bodies of those they had loved, but believing with absolute conviction that the alternative was far worse. Yet sometimes, despite every precaution, despite every prayer and protective charm, despite the nails and the sickles and the coins, the transformation would still occur. The 40 days would pass, the proper rituals would be observed, the grave would be sealed and blessed, but the signs would begin to appear anyway. A mysterious wasting sickness would creep through the family of the deceased. Cattle would begin producing sour milk, or none at all. Strange noises would echo from empty rooms in the dead of night, and the community would know with sinking hearts that their worst fears had been realized. Somewhere beneath the earth, in the darkness of a coffin that should have been a final resting place, something stirred with unnatural life. The dead had refused to remain dead, and the Strigoi had completed its terrible metamorphosis from human being to supernatural predator. When this nightmare became reality, the creature that emerged was no longer recognizable as the person it had once been. Death had not taken it gently, but had twisted and corrupted its essence, transforming love into hunger, memory into malevolence, and human connection into predatory instinct. The Strigoi that rose from its grave retained the physical appearance of the deceased, but behind familiar eyes burned an intelligence that was utterly alien, driven by needs that no living person could comprehend. This was not the romantic vampire of Gothic literature, beautiful and seductive in its evil. This was something far more intimate and therefore far more terrifying. It wore the face of a father, a mother, a child, a spouse, but it had become a hollow vessel filled with insatiable appetite and boundless spite. It remembered its former life, not with nostalgia, but with resentment, seeing the living as thieves who had stolen the existence that should still be its own. The newly risen Strigoi would not wander aimlessly through the night like some mindless revenant. Its movements were guided by the invisible threads of memory and connection that bound it to its former existence. It would be drawn inexorably toward the places it had known in life, but most powerfully toward the people it had loved. For love itself had become twisted into something possessive and consuming. Its first destination would almost always be its own home, the place where it had spent its living years, where its mortal body had known comfort and security. But the creature that approached this familiar threshold was no longer seeking comfort. It was seeking sustenance, and it would find that sustenance in the very people who mourned its passing. The Strigoi did not need to break down doors or shatter windows to gain entry. Death had granted it abilities that transcended physical limitations. It could seep through keyholes like smoke, flow down chimneys like water, or slip through the smallest cracks in walls with the fluid grace of a shadow. No lock could keep it out. No barrier could turn it away, for it was returning to a place where it had every right to be, armed with the terrible logic of the grave. And here at Vanishing Legends, we've only begun to explore the true horror of what happened when the Strigoi returned home to those who had loved it most in life. Because the deepest terror of this legend lies not in the monster itself, but in the unbearable intimacy of its victims. Once inside its former home, the undead creature would move through rooms that had once been filled with its laughter, past furniture it had touched with living hands, toward beds where it had once slept peacefully beside those it had cherished above all others. But now it approached these sleeping forms not as a protector, but as a predator, drawn by the warm pulse of life that it had lost and desperately sought to reclaim. The attack, when it came, was unlike anything described in the sensational vampire tales of popular fiction. There were no dramatic puncture wounds, no theatrical swooning, no passionate embraces that blurred the line between love and death. Instead, the Strigoi's assault was subtle, insidious, a slow draining of vitality that left its victims weakened and confused rather than dramatically transformed. The sleeper would feel a crushing weight settle upon their chest, as if invisible hands were pressing down with the force of the grave itself. Their breath would become labored, their limbs paralyzed, their consciousness trapped between waking and sleeping in a nightmare state, where terror was the only sensation that remained sharp and clear. They might glimpse a familiar silhouette standing beside their bed, a beloved face twisted into an expression of such hunger and malevolence that their mind would refuse to accept what their eyes were showing them. Sometimes the touch was more direct but no less horrifying. A single icy finger might trace across exposed skin, leaving behind a small bruise that would darken and spread like a stain of death itself. The victim would wake with this mark upon them, a tangible proof that something unnatural had visited them in the darkness, something that had claimed a small piece of their life force as its own. But the physical symptoms were only the beginning of the Strigoi's assault upon its family. The psychological torment was far more devastating than any bodily harm. Night after night, the creature would return, appearing in dreams with increasing vividness and malevolence. It would speak in the voice of the loved one it had been, but its words would be filled with accusations and threats, blame, and supernatural rage. The victims would find themselves caught in an impossible emotional trap. The rational part of their minds understood that their beloved family member was dead and buried, that what visited them in the darkness could not possibly be real. But their hearts recognized the face, the voice, the mannerisms of someone they had known more intimately than any other person on earth. How could they reject what appeared to be their husband's ghost, their mother's spirit, their child's soul crying out from beyond the grave? This internal conflict between reason and recognition, between grief and terror, between love and survival, would tear at the sanity of the Strigoi's victims like claws raking across exposed nerves. They would begin to waste away not just physically, but emotionally, their strength sapped by the constant battle between what they knew to be impossible and what they experienced as undeniably real. The family members closest to the deceased would show the most dramatic decline. They would lose their appetite, finding food tasteless and difficult to swallow. Their sleep would be fractured by nightmares so vivid that they would wake exhausted rather than refreshed. Their skin would take on a pale, waxy appearance, as if the very color was being drained from their flesh, along with their vitality. Children were particularly vulnerable to this supernatural predation. Their natural openness to the world of spirits, combined with their deep emotional bonds to deceased family members, made them ideal targets for the Strigoi's hunger. A child might begin speaking to empty corners of their room, carrying on conversations with an invisible presence that their parents could neither see nor hear. They would grow thin and listless, their bright laughter fading into hollow silence. But the Strigoi's malevolence extended far beyond the walls of its former home. Like ripples spreading from a stone cast into still water, its influence would radiate outward through the entire community, bringing blight and misfortune to neighbors who had never done it any harm. The creature's very existence was an affront to the natural order, and reality itself would begin to warp and sicken in response to its presence. Livestock would begin to behave strangely, refusing to graze in certain fields or enter specific barns. Cows would give sour milk or none at all, their udders mysteriously dry despite appearing healthy and well-fed. Chickens would stop laying eggs, horses would shy away from particular paths, and dogs would howl through the night at threats that human senses could not detect. The Strigoi was believed to possess the power to tie the reins, binding the natural weather patterns with supernatural force and bringing devastating droughts that could last for months. Crops would wither in the fields despite the farmers' best efforts, their green shoots turning brown and brittle as if touched by invisible fire. Wells that had flowed freely for generations would run dry, their waters seeming to retreat deep into the earth to escape the creature's corrupting influence. When storms did come, they would arrive with unnatural fury, bringing hail in the middle of summer that could destroy an entire harvest in minutes. These supernatural tempests would strike with surgical precision, devastating the fields of some families while leaving their neighbors' crops completely untouched, a clear sign that the weather itself had become a weapon in the hands of the undead. Disease would spread through the village with patterns that defied all medical understanding. Healthy adults would suddenly fall ill with mysterious wasting sicknesses that no physician could diagnose or cure. Children would develop strange marks on their skin that would spread and darken like brands burned by invisible hands. Entire families would be struck down by ailments that seemed to leap from house to house with the randomness of lightning, but the persistence of plague. The Strigoi was transforming from a family tragedy into a community catastrophe, its hunger growing stronger with each life it touched, its malevolence spreading like a spiritual infection that threatened to consume everything it encountered. The The village that had once been a place of safety and belonging was becoming a landscape of terror where no one could trust the shadows, and everyone wondered who among them might be next to feel the touch of the undead. And in the center of this expanding circle of fear and suffering lay a simple grave, where something that should have been at rest was instead growing stronger with each passing night, fed by the terror it created and the lives it slowly drained. The community was facing an enemy that could not be reasoned with, could not be appeased, and could not be escaped by any conventional means. The only solution would be one that violated every principle of Christian burial, every instinct of human decency, every natural reluctance to disturb the peace of the dead. But when the survival of the entire village hung in the balance, when children were wasting away and crops were failing and the very fabric of reality seemed to be unravelling, even the most sacred taboos would have to be broken, the hunt for the Strigoi was about to begin. The evidence was mounting like storm clouds on the horizon. The wasting sickness had claimed 3 members of the Popescu family in as many weeks. Their cattle had begun producing milk tinged with blood, and strange holes had appeared overnight in the freshly turned earth of the cemetery. The whispers that had started as fearful speculation were hardening into grim certainty. Someone among their recently buried dead was no longer resting in peace, but identifying the source of their supernatural plague required more than mere suspicion. In a village where death visited regularly, where several souls might have departed in a single harsh winter, the community faced a terrifying question: which grave harbored the monster? The thought of desecrating every recent burial was unthinkable, an act of mass sacrilege that would damn their souls as surely as the Strigoi threatened their bodies. The solution lay in the wisdom of their ancestors and the pure instincts of the animal kingdom. For this most crucial of tasks, they would turn to a creature whose spiritual sensitivity could pierce the veil between worlds and identify the presence of evil with supernatural certainty. They needed a horse, but not just any horse would suffice for this sacred detection ritual. The animal had to be of absolutely pure color, either black as the midnight sky or white as fresh snow, without so much as a single spot or marking of another hue anywhere on its coat. This purity was essential, for only an unblemished creature possessed the spiritual clarity necessary to sense the corruption of the undead. The horse would serve as a living compass, its natural revulsion to evil guiding the villagers to their target with an accuracy that human perception could never achieve. The ritual itself was a solemn procession that transformed the quiet cemetery into a theatre of supernatural investigation. A young boy, chosen for his innocence and purity, would mount the sacred horse, while the entire village gathered in tense silence. Their torches and lanterns would cast dancing shadows across the weathered tombstones, creating an atmosphere thick with dread and desperate hope. Slowly, methodically, the boy would guide the horse through the graveyard, weaving between the crooked markers and sunken mounds of earth. The villagers would follow at a respectful distance, their eyes fixed not on the graves, but on the animal itself, watching for any sign of supernatural recognition. Most graves would pass without incident, the horse's hooves clicking against stone and soil with steady, unremarkable rhythm. But then, as they approached the resting place of the true Strigoi, everything would change. The horse would stop, as if it had struck an invisible wall, its entire body rigid with terror that no human eye could see but every human heart could feel. Its ears would flatten against its skull, its eyes would roll white with primordial fear, and often it would rear up on its hind legs, fighting desperately against being led any closer to the source of its supernatural dread. This was the moment of terrible confirmation. The pure beast had found the unholy spirit, identifying with animal certainty what human investigation could only suspect. The grave was marked, the target identified, and now the most sacred taboo of all would have to be shattered in service of the community's survival. If you're finding this journey into Romania's darkest folklore as captivating as I am, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because Vanishing Legends has so much more to explore. We're diving deep into legends that most people have forgotten, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Under the cover of darkness, when even the moon seemed to hide behind clouds, as if unwilling to witness what was about to transpire, the men of the village would gather at the cemetery gates. Their faces were grim with the weight of necessity, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they were about to commit an act that would have horrified their grandmothers and shocked their priests. But the alternative was the slow death of their entire community, and that prospect outweighed even the deepest religious convictions. The tools they carried were not the ornate implements of ceremony, but the crude, practical instruments of desperate labor. Shovels worn smooth by countless hands, pickaxes that had broken ground for wells and foundations, ropes strong enough to bear the weight of coffins that should have remained buried forever. These were the weapons of their war against the supernatural, blessed not by priests, but by pure necessity. The digging began with the scrape of metal against earth, a sound that seemed to echo through the night like a violation of nature itself. The work was hard, and the atmosphere thick with more than just the physical exertion of their labor. Every shovelful of dirt removed brought them closer to a confrontation with something that should not exist. Something that had once been their neighbor, their friend, perhaps even their family member. The rhythm of their work was punctuated only by the heavy breathing of the diggers and the occasional whispered prayer, as if words spoken too loudly might alert the creature below to their approach. Sweat mixed with soil on their faces, and more than one man would pause to cross himself before continuing the grim excavation that would determine the fate of their village. Hours passed, like centuries, until finally, inevitably, a shovel struck wood with a hollow thud that sent chills through every spine present. The coffin lay exposed in the bottom of the pit, a rectangular shadow darker than the darkness surrounding it. Now came the moment that would test not just their courage, but their very sanity, for they were about to look upon the face of the undead and see what death had made of someone they had once known in life. With ropes and raw strength born of desperation, the heavy wooden box was hauled from its earthly prison and placed upon the ground beside the violated grave. The village elder, or perhaps the bravest among them, would approach the coffin with trembling hands, knowing that what lay within would either confirm their worst fears or reveal them to be the victims of mass hysteria. A final prayer would be muttered, a final breath held, and then the lid would be pried open with the screech of nails being torn from wood. The entire community would lean forward as one, their torchlight falling upon the interior of the coffin and illuminating secrets that no living eyes should ever witness. What they discovered would depend entirely upon whether their supernatural detective work had been accurate. But if they had chosen correctly, if the horse's instincts had guided them true, then the sight that greeted them would be proof positive that the natural order had been grotesquely violated. The body would not show the expected signs of decay that should have marked weeks or months of burial. Instead, it would appear strangely preserved, its flesh retaining a ruddy, lifelike complexion that seemed to mock the pale, waxy appearance of normal corpses. The limbs would be supple and flexible rather than rigid with the stiffness of death, as if the creature had merely been sleeping rather than deceased. Most shocking of all would be the presence of fresh liquid blood, pooled at the corners of the mouth or staining the burial shroud with evidence of recent feeding. This was the ultimate proof that the corpse had been leaving its grave to sustain itself on the life force of the living, returning each dawn to its coffin like some terrible reverse of resurrection. The hair and fingernails would appear to have grown since burial, another sign that some form of unnatural life persisted within the supposedly dead flesh. Sometimes the burial shroud itself would show signs of having been chewed from the inside, evidence that the creature's hunger had driven it to consume even its own grave clothes, while waiting for opportunities to feed on more substantial prey. But perhaps most disturbing of all would be the eyes, wide open and staring upward from the coffin with an awareness that belonged neither to the living nor the properly dead. These were not the peaceful, closed eyes of eternal rest, but the alert, predatory gaze of something that watched and waited and hungered for things that no human being should ever desire. The villagers gathered around that open grave would find themselves looking not at their departed loved one, but at a mockery of human form, a shell of familiar features animated by something alien and malevolent. This was not resurrection, but perversion, not miraculous return, but supernatural infection. The person they had known was gone forever, and what remained was a parasite wearing their face. The evidence was undeniable, the verdict clear. This was no longer their father, their neighbor, their friend. This was a Strigoi in its fully realized form, and it had to be destroyed not with the gentle mercy shown to the living, but with the absolute finality reserved for abominations that threatened the natural order itself. The second killing was about to begin, and this time there would be no possibility of return. The tools required for this final confrontation were as specific as they were grim, each one chosen not merely for its practical effectiveness, but for its symbolic power in the supernatural realm. The most famous of these implements, known around the world through countless stories and films, was the wooden stake that would be driven through the creature's heart. But this was not a random piece of wood hastily cut from any available tree. The material mattered immensely in the cosmic battle between good and evil. The stake had to be carved from ash, known for its protective properties and association with the world tree of ancient mythology. Or perhaps hawthorn, whose thorns had crowned the head of Christ, and whose wood therefore carried the blessing of ultimate sacrifice. Wild rose was another option, its natural thorns serving as barbs that would prevent the evil spirit from escaping once it had been impaled. The act of staking was not performed lightly or without ceremony. The strongest man in the village would raise the pointed shaft above the creature's chest, aiming for the heart that had once pumped with human blood, but now served as the seat of supernatural malevolence. With a single, powerful blow, the stake would be driven deep into the corrupted flesh, pinning the undead thing to the bottom of its coffin and preventing it from ever rising again. But even this dramatic act was often considered insufficient to guarantee the monster's complete destruction. The villagers understood that they were dealing with forces beyond normal human comprehension, entities that might find ways to circumvent even the most thorough precautions. Additional measures were required to ensure that their terrible work would be permanent and absolute. Decapitation followed staking with the mechanical precision of butchers preparing meat. Though the men who performed this grisly task were farmers and craftsmen, driven to acts they would never have imagined themselves capable of under normal circumstances. The severed head would be placed between the feet of the corpse or buried separately in distant ground, ensuring that even if some trace of supernatural life remained, it could never reassemble itself into a coherent threat. Garlic would be stuffed into the mouth of the corpse, not merely as protection, but as a form of spiritual binding that would prevent the creature from speaking curses or calling out to other dark entities for aid. The pungent bulb served as both gag and ward, silencing the voice that might otherwise continue to work evil even from beyond the grave. But the ultimate purification, the final act that would reduce the supernatural threat to nothing more than memory, required the ancient power of fire. The heart, that organ which had been the source of the creature's unnatural vitality, would be cut from the chest with the same matter-of-fact brutality that characterized the entire proceedings. This grotesque trophy would then be carried to a crossroads at the stroke of midnight, that liminal time when the veil between worlds was thinnest and magical workings were at their most potent. There, where three paths met and no single authority held dominion, a pyre would be built and the heart would be burned until nothing remained but fine black ash scattered on the wind. The symbolism was as important as the practical effect. Fire had always been humanity's weapon against the darkness, the force of purification that could cleanse even the most stubborn corruption. By reducing the Strigoi's heart to ash, the villagers were not merely destroying its physical form, but annihilating the very essence of its evil, ensuring that no trace of its malevolent spirit could linger to trouble future generations. With the body pinned, decapitated, and its heart reduced to cinders, the physical threat was finally eliminated. But the ritual was not yet complete, for the creature's victims still bore the marks of its supernatural predation and required healing that could only come from the monster itself. The ashes of the burned heart, still warm from their purifying fire, would be carefully collected and mixed with clean water drawn from the village well. This macabre medicine represented the ultimate irony of the Strigoi legend. The creature that had drained life from its victims would, in its destruction, provide the cure for its own evil influence. The afflicted family members, those who had suffered from the wasting sickness and midnight visitations, would be given this ash-laden water to drink. The logic of sympathetic magic demanded that the poison and its antidotes spring from the same source, that the vampire's own essence should undo the harm it had inflicted upon the innocent. As they swallowed this grim draught, the victims would feel their stolen vitality beginning to return. Color would creep back into pale cheeks, strength would flow into weakened limbs, and the terrible dreams that had plagued their sleep would finally cease. The curse was broken, the natural order restored, and the community could begin to heal from the supernatural wound that had threatened to destroy them all. The night's work was finished, the monster was dead, and the village was safe. But the memory of what they had been forced to do, the knowledge that death was not always the end and that love could be twisted into something predatory and evil, would linger in their collective consciousness like a scar that never fully faded. They had learned that sometimes the greatest threat comes not from strangers in the darkness, but from those we trust most completely, that the face of evil might be as familiar as our own reflection, and that the price of survival sometimes requires us to destroy what we once held most dear. The legend of the Strigoi had been written in blood and ash, in violated graves and broken hearts, in the terrible necessity of killing what should already have been dead. It was a story that spoke to the deepest fears of every human community, that our loved ones might not love us in return, that death might not bring the peace we hope for, and that sometimes salvation requires us to become the very monsters we fear. At Vanishing Legends, we understand that these ancient terrors reveal truths about the human condition that transcend the specific cultures that created them. The Strigoi may have been Romania's nightmare, but the fears it embodied are universal, timeless, and as relevant today as they were centuries ago, when frightened villagers gathered around violated graves to confront the unthinkable. But as we stand at the edge of this blood-soaked tale, we must ask ourselves a deeper question. What was the real monster that these terrified villagers were fighting? What drove entire communities to commit acts that would have been unthinkable under any other circumstances? The answer lies not in supernatural evil, but in the far more complex realm of human psychology and the desperate need to make sense of a world that often defied understanding. Consider for a moment the symptoms that marked a Strigoi's victims. The gradual wasting away, the persistent cough that echoed through sleepless nights, the pale complexion that grew more ghostly with each passing day. These were not the signs of supernatural predation, but the unmistakable markers of one of history's most devastating killers, tuberculosis, known in those times as consumption. When this highly contagious disease swept through a household, claiming family members one by one in a pattern of inexorable decline, it would have appeared exactly like the work of a returning spirit feeding on its loved ones. The first to die would seem to reach out from beyond the grave to claim their spouse, their children, their siblings in a grotesque parody of familial affection. The disease's ability to lie dormant before manifesting symptoms meant that seemingly healthy individuals could suddenly begin their decline. as if touched by an invisible hand in the darkness. The Strigoi legend provided something that medical science could not. An enemy with a face, a threat that could be identified, confronted, and ultimately destroyed. In a world where germs were invisible and contagion was mysterious, blaming a supernatural predator offered both explanation and hope. If the cause was a vengeful spirit, then that spirit could be hunted down and eliminated. If the source was a loved one transformed into a monster, then that monster could be staked, burned, and reduced to ash. But the legend served another, perhaps even more crucial psychological function. It provided a socially acceptable outlet for the complex, messy, and often painful realities of family relationships that death had left forever unresolved. Why did the Strigoi almost invariably attack its own family first? Perhaps because it was within the family that the deepest resentments festered, where the most bitter words had been spoken, where love and hate intertwined in ways that could never be untangled by mere conversation. The abusive father who had terrorized his household in life became a literal monster in death, allowing his victims to finally confront and destroy the source of their trauma. The manipulative mother who had controlled her children through guilt and emotional blackmail could be recast as a supernatural predator whose influence had to be severed with stake and flame. The bitter sibling who had carried grudges to the grave could be transformed from family member into enemy, making their symbolic destruction not just acceptable, but necessary for the survival of those left behind. The ritual of the second killing then becomes something far more complex than simple monster hunting. It was a form of psychological catharsis, a way for traumatized families to externalize their pain and give it physical form that could be confronted and defeated. By declaring their tormentor a creature of evil, they granted themselves permission to reject everything that person had represented, to purge their memory from the family narrative, and to begin the process of healing from wounds that might otherwise have festered for generations. The community aspect of these rituals was equally important. In small villages, where everyone knew everyone else's business, where family secrets were impossible to keep and domestic troubles became public knowledge, the Strigoi legend provided a way to address systemic problems without directly challenging the authority structures that might have enabled them. The village drunk whose binges had impoverished his family could be posthumously blamed for supernatural attacks on his children's health. The merchant whose dishonest dealings had cheated, his neighbors could be held responsible for blighted crops and failed harvests. This collective participation in the monster's destruction served as a form of community healing, allowing entire villages to purge themselves of individuals whose behavior had poisoned the social fabric. The ritual violation of the grave became a symbolic cleansing of the body politic, a way to excise the cancerous elements that threatened the health of the whole community. The psychological power of these legends extended beyond immediate trauma response into the realm of social control. The threat of becoming a Strigoi after death served as a powerful deterrent against antisocial behavior during life. Those who mistreated their families, who cheated their neighbors, who violated the moral codes that held the community together, faced not just social disapproval, but the terrifying prospect of post-mortem punishment that could last for eternity. The specific circumstances that were believed to create Strigoi read like a catalogue of social anxieties and moral prohibitions. Suicide was perhaps the most feared because it represented the ultimate rejection of community values, a selfish act that abandoned family and neighbors to deal with the consequences. Death by violence suggested a life lived outside the bounds of civilized society. Dying with unconfessed sins or unresolved grudges indicated a person who had prioritized personal grievances over spiritual and social harmony. Even the protective rituals surrounding suspected Strigoi graves served important psychological functions. The elaborate precautions taken during burial, the specific positioning of the body, the placement of protective objects, all gave the living a sense of agency in the face of death's ultimate powerlessness. They could not prevent death from claiming their loved ones, but they could at least feel that they were taking active steps to ensure those deaths would not bring further harm. The communal nature of these protective measures also reinforced social bonds at precisely the moment when those bonds were most threatened by loss and grief. Neighbours would come together to help with the complex rituals, sharing the burden of both physical labour and emotional trauma. The shared belief in supernatural threats created a shared responsibility for supernatural protection, binding the community together through common purpose and mutual dependence. But perhaps most importantly, the Strigoi legend provided a framework for understanding and processing grief itself. The idea that the dead remained present, that they continued to influence the world of the living, offered comfort to those struggling with the Fin. The transformation from benevolent memory to malevolent spirit paral, still connection, still proof that love transcends the boundaries of mortality, ality of loss. Even when that presence was malevolent, it was still presence eld the natural progression of grief, from the initial idealization of the deceased through the anger and resentment that often follow, to the eventual acceptance and integration of loss into the survivor's ongoing life story. The ritual destruction of the Strigoi represented the final stage of this process, the moment when the living could finally let go of their complex relationship with the dead and move forward into a future unburdened by the weight of unresolved past. Modern psychology recognizes this same pattern in what we now call complicated grief, a condition where the normal process of mourning becomes stuck, where the bereaved cannot move past their loss and integrate it into a healthy, ongoing life. The symptoms described in Strigoi victims, the wasting away, the disrupted sleep, the sense of being drained of vitality, mirror almost exactly the clinical presentation of severe depression and anxiety disorders that can follow traumatic loss. The community interventions described in these legends, the gathering of neighbours to identify and address the source of the problem, the collective action taken to resolve the crisis, the shared rituals designed to restore normalcy, all represent sophisticated forms of social support that modern grief counselling attempts to recreate in clinical settings. In this light, the Strigoi legend reveals itself as far more than simple superstition. It was a complex psychological and social technology, a system for processing trauma, managing conflict, and maintaining community cohesion in the face of forces that threatened to tear the social fabric apart. The monsters were real, but they were not supernatural. They were the very human monsters of disease, abuse, neglect, and social dysfunction, given supernatural form so that they could be confronted and defeated by communities that lacked other tools for addressing such complex problems. The legend's persistence across centuries and its influence on vampire folklore around the world suggests that it addressed needs that transcend specific cultures and historical periods. The fear of the returning dead, the anxiety about unresolved relationships, the need to make sense of inexplicable suffering. These are universal human experiences that every society must find ways to address. Here at Vanishing Legends, we understand that the most powerful folklore often contains the deepest truths about human nature, hidden beneath layers of supernatural narrative that make difficult realities easier to confront and process. The Strigoi may have been Romania's monster, but the fears it embodied and the needs it served are part of our shared human heritage. The rituals of detection and destruction that surrounded the Strigoi legend also reveal sophisticated understanding of group psychology and social dynamics. The use of animals to identify supernatural threats recognized what modern science has confirmed, that many animals possess sensory capabilities that exceed human perception and can detect subtle changes in environment and behavior that humans miss. A horse's refusal to pass over a particular grave might have been triggered by any number of natural factors: unusual scents from decomposition, subtle changes in ground stability, or even the anxiety of its human handlers communicated through unconscious body language. But in the context of a community desperate for answers, This animal behavior became supernatural revelation, providing the certainty needed to justify extreme action. The collective nature of the grave opening, the requirement that the entire community witness the evidence of supernatural infection, served important functions beyond simple verification. It distributed responsibility for the violation of sacred space across the entire group, ensuring that no individual bore the full moral and spiritual weight of the desecration. It also created shared experience and collective memory, binding the community together through participation in extraordinary events that would be remembered and retold for generations. The specific signs that were interpreted as evidence of vampiric activity, the apparent preservation of the corpse, the presence of liquid blood, the growth of hair and nails, all had perfectly natural explanations that modern forensic science understands well. Bodies buried in certain soil conditions can be remarkably well preserved. Blood can pool and remain liquid in corpses for extended periods under specific circumstances. Hair and nails can appear to grow after death as the surrounding tissue shrinks and recedes. But in a pre-scientific world, these natural phenomena became supernatural evidence, proof positive that the natural order had been violated and extraordinary measures were required to restore it. The interpretation of these signs was not random but followed logical patterns that served the psychological and social needs of the interpreters. The communal response to perceived Strigoi activity also demonstrated sophisticated understanding of crisis management and social healing. The escalating series of protective measures, from individual household precautions to community-wide defensive actions, provided a graduated response that allowed for multiple opportunities to resolve the crisis without resorting to the ultimate violation of grave desecration. The involvement of religious and secular authorities in these processes, even when they officially disapproved of the practices, recognized the real social needs that these rituals addressed. Priests who privately shared their parishioners' fears while publicly condemning their superstitions were acknowledging the gap between official doctrine and lived experience, between theological theory and practical psychology. The legend of the Strigoi stands as one of humanity's most profound attempts to give form to formless fears, to create a monster that could be hunted when the real monsters, disease, trauma, and social dysfunction proved too elusive to confront directly. In the end, the villagers were not fighting supernatural predators, but the very human demons that lurk within every community, within every family, within every heart that has loved and lost and struggled to make peace with that loss.